Hello, everyone. I wish you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore how Mr. Hoan corners Diep with a luxury meeting, breakup papers, and $20,000, then promises to weaponize public opinion in a way that could steal Nai's peace. Because what happens next changes everything. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The morning starts soft and ordinary at Diep's home. Porridge warms on the stove. A small bowl of cut fruit waits on the table. Outside, a neighbor's wind chime taps once, then goes quiet. Nai sits on the floor with her crayons, building a careful rainbow on plain paper. She doesn't ask for much. She just glances up every few minutes to make sure Diep is still in the room. Jamie stands by the sink, rinsing the same cup twice. It's not about the cup. It's about staying busy so his mind doesn't run ahead to shadows. Diep watches him without staring. She knows his tells now. The tight jaw, the slow breath, the way his hand hovers near his phone like it might bite. They eat together. Not fancy, just warm. James bows his head when Diep whispers a short prayer of thanks. He follows her lead, quiet and respectful, like he wants the peace to last. Then the phone buzzes. The sound is small, but it slices the kitchen air. Diep's spoon pauses. James' eyes lift, sharp. Diep reads the message once, then again, slower. Grand Orchid Lounge, 2 p.m. Come alone. Mr. Hoan. A second line appears right after. Bring your ID. This is about your future. Diep's throat tightens. James' chair shifts back a fraction. He doesn't speak yet, because he's trying not to scare Nai with his face. Diep turns the screen so he can see. James reads, and the muscles beside his mouth tense like he's holding something back. No, he says low. One word. Heavy. Diep sets the phone down, face up this time like she refuses to hide what is real. If I don't go, she says, he will come to places I can't control. James' gaze flicks toward Nai, toward the little backpack on the hook, toward the front door. The fear in him is not for himself. He said alone, James answers. And he chose a public place, Diep says. That means he wants control without noise. James exhales through his nose. He taps the table once, a quiet beat like a judge's gavel in his own head. I drive you, he says. I wait outside. Diep hesitates. Then she nods. Cause and effect. Simple and heavy. Before they leave, Diep slips her wallet into her bag. She checks one thing without thinking. Nai's photo is still there. Nai smiling, missing one baby tooth, holding a paper flower. James kneels to help Nai put on her shoes. He doesn't talk too much. He just ties the laces carefully, like each loop is a promise. Nai presses her drawing into Diep's hand. On the top, in uneven letters, she has written, Home. Diep's eyes burn. She swallows it down. She won't cry in front of her child. Not today. On the drive, the city looks normal. People cross streets. A bus sighs at a stop. But inside the car, time feels thinner, like one wrong move could tear it. At a red light, James says, whatever he offers, don't take it in your hands. Diep nods. I won't. And if he tries to shame you, James adds, remember who you are. Diep looks at the road ahead, not at him. I'm trying. The Grand Orchid Lounge is polished and bright, the kind of place where voices stay soft and pain stays hidden. A hostess leads Diep behind a screen of white flowers. James stays outside, close enough to see the entrance, far enough to respect the rule on the message. A waiter sets tea in front of Diep, then retreats without a smile. The silence he leaves behind feels planned. Mr. Hoan sits already waiting. Dark suit, clean hands, a calm face that doesn't ask permission to judge. He stands halfway, then sits again, like courtesy is optional. Diep, he says, as if her name is a document. Diep sits straight. Her fingers clasp in her lap so he won't see them tremble. Mr. Hoan doesn't waste time. His voice is even, almost bored. Then I will use something you can't stand. Public opinion. Diep blinks. The threat lands before the conversation even begins. A rhythm switch, a slap. Without a hand, she keeps her face steady. We haven't even spoken. Mr. Hoan leans back. You're already known, he says. People talk. People guess. I can help those guesses grow. Diep hears Ni's schoolyard in her mind. The gate. The mothers. The quick looks. The quiet distance. What do you want? Diep asks. Mr. Hoan's gaze tracks her like a scale weighing meat. I want my son protected. From me? Diep says. Mr. Hoan's eyes sharpen by a fraction, and then he gives her the line that explains his whole spine. I was once poor, once humiliated. I won't let my son fall for a girl who's only after money. Diep's cheeks warm. Not shame, rage. She forces herself to breathe slow and quiet. Older hearts can follow clear emotion better than loud emotion. You don't know my life, Diep says. I know hunger, Mr. Hoan answers. I know what people will do to climb out of it. Diep's hands squeeze together under the table. She pictures herself skipping meals so Ni could eat. She pictures washing the same dress 3 times because she couldn't buy a new one. Hunger is not a rumor to her. Mr. Hoan reaches down and lifts a thick envelope from beside his chair. He sets it on the table between them. It lands with a muted thud. The sound feels louder than the music in the lounge. He slides a folder beside it. Papers, printed clean, names already typed. He taps the top page once. Sign the breakup papers. Consider it compensation. Diep's stomach drops. The offer is not just money. It is a story Mr. Hoan wants to write about her. She stares at the envelope. She does not move toward it. Mr. Hoan waits, watching her eyes, waiting for greed to show itself, waiting for proof he can point at later. Diep opens her bag slowly and pulls out her wallet. Not for money, for courage. Inside, Ni's photo stares back with a bright, harmless smile. Diep looked at the money, then at Ni's photo in her wallet. Her hands trembled, but she didn't touch it. The beat hangs in the air. The whole room seems to pause around that simple choice. Diep puts the wallet back in her bag with care, like she is placing her child behind a locked door. Then she reaches forward, not to take the envelope, but to push it back across the table. The leather slides toward Mr. Hoan's side, firm and clean. Diep's voice comes out low and steady. You can buy anything, but you can't buy my love. Mr. Hoan's mouth curves. Not warm, not surprised. Cold, like he expected her to refuse so he could use the refusal too. He gathers the envelope with 2 fingers, as if it is nothing. Love, he says, tasting the word like it annoys him. Love doesn't pay when the world turns on you. Diep's eyes stay on him. Then don't turn it. Mr. Hoan gives a small exhale that could be a laugh if he had joy left. You think you're protecting my son, he says. But you're pulling him into a fight he didn't ask for. Diep's shoulders tense. He chose me. Mr. Hoan's gaze sharpens again, and Diep feels the pressure tighten, not with volume, but with certainty. He leans forward just slightly. If you stay, he says, people will ask why. They will assume why. They will decide why. Diep hears the word assume like a door locking. And when they decide, Mr. Hoan continues, they won't ask you for the truth. Diep's throat feels dry. She sees it clearly now. He isn't trying to win Jaime back with love. He's trying to push Diep out with shame. A server passes behind the flower screen. A faint clink. Another pattern interrupt. Life pretending nothing matters. Diep keeps her hand still. I'm not signing, she says. Mr. Hoan stands. The movement is slow, controlled, practiced. Then we're finished, he says. Diep stands too. Her legs feel light, but she stays upright. We were never negotiating, she answers. Mr. Hoan's smile returns, just as cold as before. Good, he says. Negotiations can be private. Public opinion is not. Diep walks out from behind the flower screen with her chin level. She doesn't run. She doesn't look around like a guilty person. Outside, the sunlight looks too normal. James steps toward her immediately. He doesn't grab her. He opens the car door. A silent question. Are you okay enough to sit? Diep sits. Her hands shake once, then she folds them together and forces them still. James watches her fingers before he asks anything. Did you sign? He says. No, Diep answers. The word loosens something in James' chest. His shoulders drop a fraction like he can breathe again. What did he say? James asks. Diep looks out the window for 1 second, collecting her mind like scattered papers. He offered money, she says, and he promised public opinion. James' jaw tightens. He doesn't swear. He doesn't raise his voice. He just turns the key and starts driving, controlled and quiet. At the next light, his phone buzzes. He glances down. His face stays calm, but his eyes darken. Diep sees the screen for a split second before he flips it face down. Tomorrow, they will start asking questions. Diep's heart sinks. He's already moving, she whispers. James' voice stays steady. Then we move first, he says. Diep turns toward him. How? James exhales. We live clean, he says. We don't hide. We don't beg. We let people see us the way we are. Diep swallows. And if they don't? James' hands tighten on the wheel. Then we keep showing the truth until the lie gets tired. When they get home, Nye runs to the doorway with her drawing. She holds it up like a shield. James crouches so he's at her level. He points at the word home and nods. He doesn't say much because he doesn't want to bring the lounge's cold air into the house. Diep hangs Nye's drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet. The action is small, but it feels like choosing a side. Later, while Nye colors at the table, Diep makes tea. James fixes a loose cabinet hinge with a screwdriver he keeps in his car. Healing looks like tiny repairs. Diep watches his hands. She realizes something. He isn't acting like a man who might leave. He is acting like a man who is already building. James sets the screwdriver down. He meets Diep's eyes and his voice is simple, not dramatic. We'll be here tomorrow, he says. Together. He reaches for the fridge and straightens the home drawing. The magnet clicks. Diep feels her pulse slow. But she also imagines a whisper starting at the school gate. Who will believe her first? Diep nods, but her stomach stays tight. She hears Mr. Hoan's calm voice again. Public opinion. As evening falls, Diep's phone buzzes. A new message from an unknown number lights the screen. People believe what they see. Smile for them. Diep doesn't answer. She locks the phone and sets it down. She looks at James across the table and she understands the next episode before it arrives. If Mr. Hoan is going to turn the world into a courtroom, the first witness will be the neighborhood. And tomorrow, the first question will sound innocent, but it will not be.
Một buổi sáng yên ấm ở nhà Diệp với nồi cháo nóng với lời cầu nguyện và bức vẽ home của Nhi bỗng bị cắt ngang bởi tin nhắn lạnh. Mr. Hoan yêu cầu Diệp đến Grand Orchid Lounge mình. James ngăn lại nhưng Diệp hiểu, nếu không đi, áp lực sẽ tràn vào những nơi cô không kiểm soát được. Tại Lao, Mr. Hoan thẳng thừng buộc tội Diệp chỉ vì tiền, đặt phong bì 20.000 đô và giấy chia tay như đền bù. Diệp nhìn tiền rồi nhìn ảnh ghi trong ví, run nhưng không chạm và trả lại. Ông có thể mua mọi thứ nhưng không mua được tình yêu. Mr. Hoan hứa sẽ cùng dư luận. Trên đường về, dấu hiệu bắt đầu xuất hiện. Ngày mai họ sẽ hỏi.